The Man-Eating Tigress of Gwaldam by J.E. Carrington Turner. She was an old tigress, quite incapable of catching the very nimble barking deer in a mountainous tract of forest. Sheer hunger had driven her to prey upon men and women, and despite her age, she had already killed more than 20 human beings. Most of her victims were women, as their daily routine involved them in the greatest of risks. After the morning's chores, which included cooking the next meal, attending to the family's cattle, sweeping the house, and removing the dung from the cattle shed to store it outside for manuring the fields, they picked up their sickles about 9 o'clock and went in small groups to the nearest forest, there to cut grass and lop oak leaves. These they made into large headloads, which they brought back to the village as night fodder for the cattle. After all this, they would cook the evening meal. They were certainly the workers in the family. During the ploughing season, the men would be busy preparing their fields for the next crop. But when the crops were standing and gradually ripening, the husbands would congregate in the wayside shops to gossip and meet in one another's houses to gamble. Very rarely would they accompany their wives to the forest. Thus, the distribution of labor in these families, residing in the villages scattered over the enormous tract of the lower Himalayas and comprising the districts of Kumaon and Garhwal, was sharply defined and very much in favor of the men. On one of my many tours in this vast territory, I happened to be staying with a friend, Robert Bellairs, at his headquarters in Kasoni in the Almora district. On his return from the war, he had immediately been appointed settlement officer to apportion out land amongst landless ex-soldiers and their families. There could not have been a better selection for such work, since he knew the country intimately, as well as the men with whom he was dealing. He had raised a complete labor corps in this very tract and commanded it in Europe and the Middle East throughout the war. Robert occupied a spacious bungalow, once the property of two brothers, Norman and Colin Troop, the former a tea planter and the latter a retired captain from the Royal Navy. Both brothers died between 1916 and 1920. Their extensive estates, comprising of tea gardens and orchards, were then acquired by the government to be handed over in the form of small but adequate holdings to the hundreds of soldiers whose services were no longer required. Though there were 2 travelers' bungalows at Kasani, Robert Bellairs would never permit me to occupy either. Immediately he heard I had arrived on tour, he would promptly walk over to the bungalows and insist on my leaving to stay much more comfortably with him. So over I would go as his guest, my camp staff being accommodated in some of the several vacant buildings. It was in this manner that I heard of the man-eating tigress of Gwaldam. Robert and I were at lunch. He had finished hearing petitions for land from a score or so of ex-army men. I had returned from my inspections of adjoining government forests, where pine trees were being tapped for crude resin, a rapidly expanding industry in those days. We had scarcely risen from the table when 2 breathless runners from Gwaldam were announced. Stepping out onto the veranda, we listened to their urgent report. They said that another woman had been killed. She had been taken by the killer when she and her companions from a village near Gwaldam had gone to the jungle to cut fodder. While they were returning, well before sunset, each with her headload of fodder, the man-eater had pounced upon one of them. Gripping and killing her, the tigress rolled the body downhill, then dragged it into the undergrowth to devour. To our many inquiries, they described the place where the tragedy had occurred. Both Robert and I were well acquainted with the forests adjoining Gwaldam. We had hunted and shot leopards in that locality. Our method was a strange one. We would sit on the ground, back to back. We found this quite unique position quite interesting, and one that met with much success, for it increased our joint vision to a complete circle. Sometimes a leopard would appear in front of him, at other times I would have the luck. Never did we allow one to pass alive. After hearing the account of the tragedy, and concluding that the man-eater would still be in the Gwaldam forest, we decided to move camp the following day, and instructed the 2 messengers to warn the villagers not to go to the forest. Robert had work in the vicinity, and I would have an opportunity of seeing the felling of pine trees by one of my contractors. We could thus profitably combine our work with an endeavor to destroy the menace. Robert, an excellent rifle shot, was anxious to make an early attempt to contact the maneater, particularly as it had already evaded him once before. He had sat in a pit near the remains of a cow which it had killed, erecting round himself a hedge of branches and leaves as camouflage. The maneater, approaching very warily, saw this strange feature in the forest from a considerable distance and evidently became deeply suspicious. It circled widely round and round, taking cover cleverly in the undergrowth, and then disappearing. Robert could hear its growls of disapproval, but it never showed itself sufficiently to give him a chance of a shot. He climbed out of his pit, stiff and disappointed, but determined to have another try. There was no difficulty in moving camp the next morning, even at such short notice. I had an excellent team of 15 mules, powerful and well cared for, capable of transporting the whole of my camp equipment and office many miles in a day. These mules were my especial care, for on their fitness depended my mobility and timely supervision of a variety of operations over a very large hilly area. Looking to the northwest from Kausani, Gwaldam was plainly visible. There were no intervening hills, only the valley of Baijnath. From Kausani, the bridle path zigzagged fairly steeply down through pine forests to Garur. Thence it had a gentle gradient to the lowest point, where there was a large village with extensively terraced fields. From here, the bridle path ascended severely through open pine forests right up to Gwaldam. At intervals, the mules, with their full loads, would stop for a few minutes to rest. Then the leader, without the least persuasion, would move forward, and the remainder would follow with their grooms alongside. Never did any of these animals require the least touch of a whip to urge them onwards on any march. The distance from Kausani to Gwaldam is about 10 miles. When, through the crowns of the pines, our destination came in sight, we saw a group of villagers waiting by the roadside. They were from the village near Gwaldam, to the northeast of it. These people were closely concerned with the tragedy. The dead woman was from their village, and her husband was with them. After the usual greetings, the men gave further details of the occurrence, and pointed to the forest where the woman was killed. We explained to them that we had specially come to try and destroy the maneater, adding that if it was necessary, we would ask them to beat the jungle. To this they readily agreed. It was very much in their interests that the tigress should be killed. As they accompanied us to Gwaldam, they went on to explain that all the women of their village were now terrified and refused to go again to the forest to bring back grass and leaf fodder for the cattle, which, in consequence, were on very short rations. To this we replied that in our opinion the women were quite right, and that it was high time the men took their turn at going to the jungle for fodder. It did not surprise us, however, that they strongly disagreed. We knew that it was in accordance with their traditions and customs for husbands to work in the fields while their wives collected fodder in the forest. Gwaldam was truly a very lovely camping site, situated on a prominent spur forming a watershed between two substantial rivers, the Pinder flowing to the west and the Gumti to the east. It was exactly on the boundary dividing the districts of Almora and Garhwal. That famous mountaineer, F.S. Smithy, one of the conquerors of the 25,447 feet tall Mount Kameth, has included in his charming book The Valley of Flowers a delightful color photograph of the great foothills from Gwaldam in the afternoon light, though unfortunately the clouds which usually gather as the day advances have obscured the mighty snowy peaks. Determined to meet the maneater, we picked up our rifles and went immediately to the portion of the forest the villagers had indicated. We followed a very narrow foot track that led through thickets of brambles and berberis. The villagers followed us silently, but as we advanced further, we thought it was prudent to dispense with their company. If it proved necessary to stalk the maneater, we preferred to do it alone. We told them to wait, that we would give them further instructions, and would ask for their help if circumstances made it essential. Amiably acquiescent, they squatted where we left them. We entered a forest of oak trees, every one of which was gnarled and misshapen, the result of continual lopping for leaf fodder. A little further ahead, we came upon a point where two footpaths met, one going roughly along the contour, the other leading southwards and up a high ridge. The entire jungle faced north, overlooking Gwaldam and the lovely vale of the Pinder River. Stopping to reconnoiter, we decided to take the narrow path along the contour and to follow it throughout its course. This was the direction the men had pointed out. The greatest vigilance was now called for to avoid being surprised by the killer. The jungle with its undergrowth made ideal conditions for a man-eater's abode. The tigress had killed only a fortnight ago, and this woman was the second victim within that time. Encouragement enough for it to continue in this particular spot. As we progressed slowly, we saw the first of the reliable signs we were looking for. Bundles of grass and leaf fodder thrown here and there by the women when one of them had cried the alarm, "Sher!" On we went for another 60 yards when we came upon the unmistakable scene of the tragedy. The bundles were scattered about, 2 of them a little above the path, but most of them below, having rolled on till they came to rest against the bushes. Sickles were still securely fastened under the ropes, holding the fodder together. Viewing our surroundings very carefully, we considered that downhill was far more interesting than uphill. So down we went, step by step and side by side. All was so quiet that we sensed tragedy and the presence of the man-eater in the very atmosphere. We were now on the line of the drag through the undergrowth. Stopping repeatedly to listen for the slightest sound and to observe any movement with our rifles ready, we went forward as silently as we could, expecting to come upon the remains of the unfortunate woman or fragments of her garments amongst the bushes. We had not gone 10 yards further when there was a violent agitation of the bushes to our right front, about 20 yards from us. Then there was stillness, and we heard low growls. It was the tigress. She had heard us and could possibly see us, but from where we stood we could not see her. We were acutely aware of this disadvantage. It was essential to change our position and maneuver slightly to try and catch a glimpse of her. Stepping very slowly a yard to our right, so as not to lose advantage of our uphill position, as we expected her to rush at us, we still failed to see any portion of her tawny body. The growls continued and grew louder. We then moved another step to the right when we both got a glimpse of her. It was a chance not to be missed. Our rifles rang out simultaneously. The tigress fell, but recovered herself, and we lost sight of her as she disappeared amongst the bushes. We quite expected her to come straight at us, but we saw by the stirring tips of the bushes that she had gone downhill. We now knew that at least one of the bullets had wounded her, and that the wound would tell increasingly as time went on. We were on the northern face of the high ridge to the south, over which the sun was about to dip. Looking at my watch, I found it was nearly 5 o'clock. It was unwise to continue the hunt in an unfavorable light, in which all the odds would be in the favor of the now infuriated man-eater. The idea of a beat so late in the afternoon was entirely out of the question. It meant risking lives unnecessarily, so we reluctantly called it a day. 2 objectives had been definitely achieved. We had found the tigress, and we had, we hoped, hurt her so severely that she would be unable to move out of the patch of jungle. The situation was full of promise for a beat on the morrow, when we would finally be able to come to grips with her again. Retracing our steps and seeing no sign of the dead woman's remains or her clothes, we reached the path and stood again for a few minutes on the very spot where the tigress had attacked the woman. After studying the surroundings and getting an idea how best to conduct the morrow's operations, we walked back along the path and found the villagers waiting for us just where we had left them. There were many inquiring and anxious looks. Telling them what had happened, we said that there was every hope of killing the tigress during the beat if they would bring at least 70 beaters in the morning. They asked about the victim's remains, to which we replied that we would carry out a thorough search after the beat. That night, after dinner, Robert and I picked up pencil and paper and worked out, by means of a sketch, just what might happen and the best way of preventing the tigress from escaping if she was still able to travel. And if she was, then which was her most probable direction? Towards the west were fairly extensive fields under cultivation. There were no trees and no scrub, which meant a complete absence of cover. We took into consideration the probability that the Tigress knew every yard of the ground. In the north, and leading down to the Pindar River, the forest opened up considerably, affording very little cover. We concluded that she was not likely to choose this direction, which would mean swimming the wide Pindar River in full view of the pursuers. So the problem really concerned the south and the east, where both forest and undergrowth continued. On these 2 points of the compass, our minds were accordingly concentrated. At the same time, as hunters experienced in the ways of wounded animals, we knew that the south and the west could not be entirely neglected. After discussion, we retired for the night, hoping the villagers would not fail us and that all would be well on the morrow with the destruction of the Tigress. Next morning, the villagers arrived in force at 7 o'clock. They had been able to muster 62 men, all told. As we were about to start out, 3 retired Garhwali officers from the 18th Royal Garhwal Rifles greeted us, saying that they had heard about yesterday's doings and had come to assist us in the beat. They carried good modern sporting rifles. These splendid men had put in their full term of service, had been through the war in France, and all 3 had been decorated for valor. They had settled down in their village homes about 3 miles from Gwaldam. They were introduced to me by Robert as Subedar Major Chaman Singh, Subedar Bhawan Singh, and Subedar Baldeo Singh. Robert knew them well. They were on his committee for considering claims and allotting land amongst ex-soldiers of their regiment. The presence of 5 guns instead of 2 helped greatly to simplify the main problem of the east and south, where the Tigress was most likely to break out. We therefore stationed 3 guns on the east, 1 gun on the south on the uphill side, and another in the north in case the disabled Tigress would only move in a downhill direction. Along the west, we placed several men on trees with instructions to clap their hands loudly if they saw the Tigress coming towards them and so make her change direction towards the guns. We decided that the beat should be from west to east, where most of the guns would be waiting. Baldeo Singh was on the north, Bhawan Singh on the south, Chaman Singh, Robert and myself in the east. To prevent accidents due to cross-firing, we ascended low-branching oak trees, which, incidentally, increased our field of vision. We instructed the beaters to climb trees at very short intervals and look carefully ahead before moving forward. With a great volume of shouting, the beat began. It had not progressed half an hour when one of the beaters, from his perch in a tree, yelled loudly that he could see the Tigress. Subedar Bhawan Singh promptly descended from his tree and climbed up beside the beater. He called out that he could also see the Tigress and that she was lying on her side. He then called out to us again, saying he would direct us to the spot where the Tigress was. Orders were given for the beat to stop, and Robert, Chaman Singh and I got down from our perches and went through the undergrowth. Bhawan Singh, from his perch, gave his directions as if he were on a parade ground, and we maintained a spacing of about 5 yards. At intervals, Bhawan Singh gave us approximate distances in addition to direction, adding that he would fire at the Tigress if she moved. Then we saw her, lying quite still in a pool of blood near her head. There was little doubt in our minds that she was dead, but we approached cautiously to examine her. Both the bullets fired by Robert and myself the previous afternoon had found their mark, one in the stomach, the other in the lungs. This latter shot had caused her to vomit much blood. In fact, she had gone less than 15 yards after being hit. She was decidedly aged and in extremely poor condition. Her left hind leg appeared to be deformed and must have been a definite disability. Several teeth, including 2 canines, were missing. We measured her at the camp and found her length from the nose to the tip of the tail to be 8 feet 5 1/4 inches. Before leaving the jungle, we scoured the undergrowth and found the woman's scanty remains. These were collected by the villagers and taken down to the left bank of the Pindar River and there cremated. Returning to Gwaldam, we enjoyed an hour's conversation with the 3 Garhwal officers, and on parting thanked them warmly for their assistance, so ably given and so very welcome. Our trip to Gwaldam had not been in vain. but it was the last of the many pleasant and thrilling adventures Robert and I had together. With his settlers now established, Robert decided to change the Himalayan skyline for the rare snows of Africa and go coffee planting near the lower slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro. The end.